right, sure thing. Welcome everybody to the Global Forum on Democratizing Work. We've got a beautiful panel here this afternoon called Next Steps for Blue-Green Alliances in North America. My name is Angela Carter. I'm an Associate Prof of Political Science at the University of Waterloo, that's in Canada. And my focus is on international comparative studies of fossil fuel wind down and just transition. I'm trying to understand and help amplify the build and wave bans on fossil fuel extraction that are being implemented by national countries in response to the climate crisis. And of course, this means my work intersects a lot with just transitions and green recovery efforts that are happening globally. So I am so excited to introduce you to the three fabulous panelists that are with us today. First, so I just want to say a couple of technical housekeeping things. I would ask that participants keep their mics off when they're not speaking, just to avoid interference. And also a reminder that the workshop is being recorded, so hopefully you're comfortable with that. Only 12 people can have their video cameras open at the same time on this platform, so priority will be given to those who are speaking. We've got an hour and a half for this session, and in terms of the format, we were thinking that we would proceed as follows. We have four thematic questions or areas that we'd really like to hear from our panelists. So the panelists will spend about 10 or 15 minutes on each question, talking with each other and giving some of their thoughts on each of those. And then we've got some time for open Q&A. So if you have questions that you would like to have answered by the panelist, you can actually put it right there, not in the chat, but in the Q&A. That's the tab that should be up there to your right. So I will get us started now with some introductions, and in the chat I'm going to be posting a couple of handles and things so you can connect to people. My handle on Twitter is right there, and I'll do the same now with Lara and then Mark and then John too. So Lara Skinner is the Executive Director of the Worker Institute at Cornell University, and she is leading the Institute's Labor Leading on Climate initiative. She's also on the board of directors for the Climate Jobs National Resource Center, which is a leading American labor-led organization in the climate movement. At the Workers Institute, she's overseeing the research, education, and training programs for Climate Jobs New York. The Climate Jobs National Resource Center, she's also leading programs there, and also for unions across the United States. So I am just going to pop into the chat a link to some of Lara's work for that initiative, and also some handles that you might want to use to connect with her. Next up, we have Mark Rowlinson, who was recently retired after having worked for over 25 years with the United Steelworkers in Canada. From 1994 to 2011, Mark worked as the counsel to the USW in Toronto, and since then he's been assistant to the Canadian National Director, a senior administrative and policy position within the union, while also serving as the president of BlueGreen Canada, which is an alliance of Canadian labor unions, environmental and civil society organizations. And now it sounds like he's as busy as ever. He's on the board of BlueGreen Canada. He's active with several organizations and advocating for working people and the environment. So for more on Mark's work and some handles to connect with him, there you go. And finally, John Peters is a research fellow in labor and climate change at the University Research Center on Globalization and Work, that's CRIMT, at Université de Montréal in Quebec. And through BlueGreen Ideas, he's specializing in research on fostering worker-centered just transitions, obviously wanting to create an economy that's sustainable and equitable and innovative. He's got a new book coming out from the University of Toronto Press, and it's called Jobs with Inequality, Financialization, Post-Democracy, and Labor Market Deregulation in Canada. So a couple of connections to John there in the chat for you as well. Okay. So we are getting started now with our first thematic area, and that's the following. So how have Blue-Green Alliances advanced just transitions, just recovery in your context, and what can we learn from those successes? So how are these coalitions being built? Who's led them? Who's supported them? What political contexts are helping here? It'd be great to hear some thoughts from the three of you and maybe some conversation among the three of you about this. Let's start with Lara.
Thank you so much, Angela, and thanks to everyone. It's great to be here today. I have to say, from my work, for many years, I focused on doing bridge building work between the labor movement and the environmental movement. and in the last few years have shifted more, and as you mentioned in my introduction, to really supporting unions in the development of what we call sort of pro-worker, pro-union climate jobs plans. And a lot of that really stems out of this idea that there are such unique challenges and opportunities that organized labor faces in trying to do this transition, that it's really important to dig into those issues and have the kind of intentional, concerted, safe space to really sort of dig into them in depth, right? What are the job opportunities? What are the new sectors that are going to be created? And how do we make sure that these are going to be high quality union jobs? And then also, on the challenges side, where are we likely to see job loss? Where are we likely to see sectors phase out? And how do we best deal with that, right? And how do we really sort of build up our own knowledge, competence, and experience to understand what needs to happen to tackle climate change, to build, net zero and low carbon sectors, and then all of the sort of labor and employment impacts of that. So, and we found in building these kind of union-only, union-led coalitions, it then really sort of helps and better positions labor to then engage with the environmental and climate movement, right? Because they've been able to sort of develop their own agenda. They have their own vision for, yes, we get it. We need to tackle the climate crisis. This is really important. But here's how we can do it in a way that's going to maximize job creation and economic development. Here's how it's going to make sure that these jobs are going to be high quality, family and community sustaining jobs. Here's how we pay for it. Here's the sort of timeline. So that's really been the focus of my work. And the other thing I would say is, we've seen some pretty significant changes within the environmental and climate movement in the US as well. There'd always been a lot of conversation around the number of jobs that could be created in the clean energy economy. We know that, it's likely that 15 to 25 million new jobs will be created in the clean energy economy over the next 10 to 15 years. It's a lot of work. What we don't know is what will the quality of those jobs be. And for us in the US, right now, fossil fuel power generation is about 20% unionized. If you look at solar, it's like 3 to 4% unionized. If you look at wind, it's like 6 to 7% unionized. And so there's a lot of concern when we talk about a just transition. There can't be a just transition if there aren't, comparably good, high quality jobs for folks to transition to. And so, we have seen, and I think it's, in part because a lot of unions have gotten more engaged in these efforts, we have seen more attention now, even from the environmental side on, okay, we get it. There's a big issue here around job quality. And then the other thing I would say is we have a really sort of growing, much more visible climate justice movement in the US. And so, a lot of the things that we're thinking about is how do you drive investment into fossil fuel impacted, frontline, underserved communities, right? That's a big part of it. In addition to a crisis of climate change, we have a crisis of inequality. So thinking about how we expand access to these jobs, particularly for frontline, underserved communities, is important as we build out this clean energy economy. In the US, the union training infrastructure is the largest training infrastructure in the world behind the military. So we have this amazing pre-apprenticeship and apprenticeship, training structure that can target local communities. It can target women, people of color, formerly incarcerated individuals, others to come in, get trained, be paid on the job, to have a lifelong career in clean energy sectors. So that's the other thing that, we're seeing a lot more sort of engagement between the labor movement and the climate justice movement is, how do we make sure that these are going to be good jobs and also expand access to these jobs, because that's really important too.
That is a powerful vision for the future that you're making happen, Lara. That's great. Mark, do you want to chime in from how things look above the border, north of the border? How will have BlueGreen Alliances advanced this notion of a just transition, just recovery? What can we learn?
Well, I think a lot of what I would say it echoes a lot of what Lara just said in terms of what's happening south of the border. But let me just very quickly, for those in attendance, give you a very brief overview of the history of BlueGreen Canada, the alliance. So it was formed in 2009, originally as an alliance between the United Steelworkers, union and Environmental Defense, a large prominent environmental organization here in Canada. It grew rapidly for 2010 to 2012 to incorporate a number of different environmental organizations, including the Pembina Institute, Clean Energy Canada, the Columbia Institute, as well as we were able to add the Chemical, Energy and Paper Workers, as well as the Canadian Auto Workers. Now, those two unions then merged to form Unifor, and we have since added the Broadbent Institute. And obviously over the last 12 years, we've done work on an enormous range of different kinds of projects, and whether that's research around the benefits of the potential employment benefits of decarbonizing our economy, or research around the potential benefits of electrifying, of decarbonizing our electricity grid, just to give you a couple of examples. But I think the main benefits, I mean, obviously these alliances are primarily formed to address this wedge issue that we often find in the public discourse around these issues, which is that you have to choose between a prosperous economy and good jobs and addressing the climate crisis. So that's the central wedge that we're trying to address. And our position obviously is that you not only do you not have to choose between those two issues, but in fact, we're either going to meet the climate challenge and have good jobs, or we're going to have neither of those two things. That addressing the two challenges must go hand in hand. So, and I think the primary thing that our alliance has brought, the one thing I'd like to highlight, is that actually we bring the workers to this discussion, right? So in Alberta, which for those outside of Canada is one of the primary sort of fossil fuel producing regions of our country, BlueGreen Canada organized 3 consecutive forums in that province, again, to bring the actual fossil fuel workers and coal workers together with industry and government and the environmental movement to have a rich and in-depth conversation about what diversifying the Alberta energy economy would look like and what a just transition would truly mean. And I think those conversations, which started back in sort of 2016, led in part to our federal task force on coal transitions, which I'm happy to talk about at some point during this discussion. But I think that, and Lara and John may or may not agree, often the just transition conversation for a lot of workers has been a slogan without a lot of substance. And so we're trying to bring a genuine worker voice to that conversation, but also bring more substance to that conversation as we move forward to address the climate challenge.
Okay, excellent. I love that. A slogan without a substance. How do we get past it? Absolutely my feeling as well. John, how about you? What are your thoughts?
Well, I think, it's really inspiring always to hear Lara speak about the kinds of initiatives they've been able to take in the United States with climate jobs, and the success of some of those alliances that has taken place both in New York and in Illinois and now in Texas, and see that they've been able to really put that package together where, as Mark just mentioned, you don't have to sacrifice jobs for a clean economy. And they've really, been putting, a lot of emphasis on bringing unions together, on, showing that actually can occur, and do it not only for, current construction workers and current unionized members, but do it for all kinds of other communities. And I think that's a sort of a great example that, everyone should be sort of looking forward to. Here in Canada, I think if you were to look more widely, we have lots of localized, different kinds of initiatives. And in some cases, I think there's been a lot of discussion about, how do we, square that, dealing with the environment, and how do we, at the same time, get jobs. And there's been lots of discussions about that. And I think overall, even despite the fact that we have, the Canadian Labour Congress, introducing a new climate policy and a climate action agenda for unions, we've had in the province of Quebec, the Provincial Federation of Labour there, unite workers in behind a climate jobs issue, right, and clean energy. We've seen the construction workers and especially in British Columbia say that, look, we have a package here for all Canadians in terms of, transitioning our buildings to, much greater efficiency. All that's taking place, and there's lots of discussions, but we still don't see those kinds of similar alliances and hardcore alliances where you're bringing, the unions inside, where people do feel comfortable, and they're bringing that sort of cross-union effort and cross-union support to the political table, right, to be able to get the politicians listen. Now there has been some success, and I think Mark is very right. I think one of the biggest changes and the most surprising changes that we've seen most recently was the development of a just transition workforce here, task force, in Alberta. And that did lead to a phase-out plan for coal, as well as economic diversification funds and support for workers. But that again is still sort of localized, and we are still a long ways away from any kind of just transition act. So in some sense, there's lots of, small developments that we can point to, and there's lots of points of light out there, but we still haven't had our sort of big light bulb moment, or our, big Hurricane Sandy moment, where everyone suddenly realized we're going to have to put our heads together, and we're really going to have to work on this if we're going to actually, move the debate forward and make sure that, all Canadians, and especially all workers, are going to get the jobs they need and that kind of sustainable economy they need in the future.
So is there anything, it sounds like you're talking with each other in some ways and responding, but is there anything the three of you would like to dig into a little bit on this and on this question, or I'll drop in the next, because in some ways we're kind of there, and that's the notion of hurdles, right? So like how are these alliances facing hurdles as you push for green jobs and better climate policy, and how are you overcoming those? So, if we can, I guess, speak a bit organically about that too. And I guess one thing I would throw in from some of the work that I've been doing recently in one of the oil producing provinces in Newfoundland and Labrador is, there's fragmentation within the unions, right? Between unions who are very much aligned with a future of expanding the fossil fuel sector, and then those that are wanting to transition, and that's making it really difficult. That's a really localized example, but I'm sure that's playing out across the sectors that you work in too. So any thoughts on hurdles, and also anything that you want to say to each other based on what you just heard? How about we start with Mark this time? We'll go in a different order. Mark?
Well, let me talk about hurdles, because that's a pretty broad question. I can think of many different kinds of hurdles. Let me talk about two different kinds of hurdles that we encounter. So the first, I suppose, hurdle that we encounter is whenever you're talking about building a coalition, there are going to be those issues that are divisive within the coalition, right? So you mentioned, Angela, that some unions, it is inevitably going to be the case that you're going to have some unions, specifically those unions that represent the most affected workers by the transition, that is to say, most likely fossil fuel workers or workers whose jobs are directly tied to fossil fuel production, are going to approach these issues differently from a union whose workers primarily are not connected to fossil fuels, or who think, hopefully correctly, that there are going to be expanded opportunities for their members as we transition to a new economy. And I guess one of the reasons why we've actually kept the Blue-Green Alliance here in Canada relatively small is that one of the ways of avoiding some of those divisions is to actually, focus your attention. So the two unions that are involved here in Canada, the Steelworkers and Unifor, are both primarily industrial unions. Both unions have members in the resource extraction sector and in energy intensive industry. And so we come at these issues to some extent from the same perspective. So I think that's one of the, and even notwithstanding that, there are other issues that we, again, we sort of agree that we're not going to necessarily tackle. The issue of energy infrastructure is obviously very controversial and can be very divisive, as between the environmental movement and the labor movement. Pipelines being the obvious example, but there are others. Nuclear power can be a challenging issue to deal with in terms of keeping the alliance together. And I guess the point, again, the issue has got to be, you have to be able to anticipate those issues and figure out how you're going to deal with them in order to keep and advancing positive solutions that will create good jobs for unionized workers rather than dwell on the potential divisive issues. So that's sort of how we deal with potential hurdles. Let me talk though a little bit about a different kind of hurdle, a sort of more macro economic hurdle that I'd be interested in having other people's view. One of the central problems in my view with the economic transition debate that we're having here in Canada is that, to be honest, most workers, especially in resource communities, but I would say workers in general in Canada, have lost faith in the ability of governments to actually support them through economic transition. And they've lost that faith on the basis of decades of experience where we have experienced economic transition in this country, for example, as a result of free trade, or as a result of resources running out, the Atlantic fishery being an example, or in the forestry sector. In other words, our workers experience economic transition all the time. What they have lost faith in is the ability of governments to actually come up with a plan to help them through that transition. And so because of that, when you now talk to workers about a just transition in the context of climate, you're automatically starting from a place where, frankly, workers in affected communities don't have a lot of confidence, not just in governments, but actually in even in unions or in any institutions to be actually, in other words, we've lost our ability to engage in the kind of economic planning that is going to be necessitated by this economic transition. So I see that actually as a kind of central hurdle, as a starting point to even having these conversations, particularly with, workers who are in the most affected sectors of the economy.
Okay, so that's a huge hurdle. Mark, you've taken something that's already really complicated and layered it with like faith in government. Thank you for making it harder. No, I'm teasing. Lara, do you want to add in a thought? Are you feeling that as well in the United States? Is that what you're experiencing, or can you name another macro or micro hurdle?
No, I think we are absolutely struggling with the same thing, and Mark's point around, just transition being fairly hollow, definitely resonates with what we've seen in the U.S. Many workers here in the U.S. call the just transition a fancy funeral. And I think so many folks in, diverse parts of the movements working on this really underestimate the complexity of just transition. And the amount of funding that you need to do it right. And I think, from the labor perspective, obviously we focus a lot on the work part of it and the workers who are potentially displaced by a transition. But I think as we, actually get into these cases, we realize it's about whole communities and regions that are impacted and displaced. And you often have, one economic activity that's supporting a whole region. And when you take that away, all sorts of other things start to fall apart. And to do the sort of community and economic development planning that you need to do to replace those activities requires years and years, right? That has to be started decades in advance to really think through, what's needed. How do we get there? How do we actually implement a plan to start a new economic activity or build off of, something that already exists, pivot and shift into a clean energy space, and then be able to create the number of jobs and ripple, economic and social benefits that you typically see from, having a big power plant or having a big industry that's, manufacturing an important good. So, that's definitely something we're dealing with, here in the state of New York. We are currently developing plans to meet our climate targets to get to a net zero economy by 2050. We have a just transition working group. Myself and a number of labor leaders serve on that working group. And I have to say, we just feel like there's not a comprehensive, coordinated view of how to reach those targets. And like I said before, what are all of the sort of socioeconomic, labor and employment impacts of that transition? And how do we sort of look at them together? And, one idea that we have had is we sort of need a new office. We need like an office of just transition and climate jobs that, you know, is bringing all of this together. It's bringing together the expertise and the capacity we need to plan this transition, which is so complex and, shifts up so many economic sectors and workplaces, but also is kind of a central hub to provide, technical assistance to communities as they think about what their role is in the transition. Provides grants to small and medium-sized businesses so they can retool for the clean energy economy. That is coordinating retraining support for workers, and then also looking ahead, right? Again, okay, we're going to build up offshore wind. Well, what are the manufacturing supply chain opportunities there? What are the type of jobs that will be created? Again, how do we make these good jobs? And, how are we really sort of incentivizing, local and regional manufacturing, which could be a great source of jobs. So that's like the type of, coordination and comprehensive perspective on this issue that I think we need to have that we just don't currently have. And then you also obviously need the funding, and you need significant funding to make that happen. So that's one thing. I mean, in terms of other challenges, a couple of other things I would mention, there are very few states in the US. We have about 4 states now that have any type of labor standards. So, job training, job quality standards on renewable energy work. They don't exist at the federal level either. So we've seen Connecticut, Maine, New York, Illinois have recently passed legislation that apply prevailing wage to renewable energy work, that apply labor peace and neutrality to operations and maintenance work, start to look at how you incentivize local and regional manufacturing of clean energy products. So you're starting to see that. In California, the utility scale solar sector is largely unionized, but that's because, unions kind of fought in the trenches over many years to make project labor agreements an industry-wide practice there. So, I just think if we have a real commitment to building an equitable clean energy economy, then we've got to see these standards. We've got to have a commitment to, job training, job quality, and wage standards in the renewable and clean energy economy if we're actually going to create high quality jobs that can sustain families and communities and reverse the trends of inequality that we're seeing. In terms of partnerships, many of the mainstream environmental organizations in the US work closely with renewable energy companies and developers. And, we've seen resistance from renewable energy companies and developers to having any sort of standards on the work. They argue we're new companies, we're, trying to get our feet under us. We can't afford to pay higher wages. We can't afford to abide by these standards. Yet most of the studies that look at, the cost of wages find that it's a very small portion of total project cost, anywhere between 3 and 7% of the total cost of a renewable energy project. So, there's that to work through. Also within the environmental movement, if you look at the climate justice movement I mentioned before, their big concern is, are we going to have access to these new clean energy jobs? Are they going to be concentrated, in communities that are already doing well, or will they go to the frontline communities that are being most impacted by climate change, that are dealing with racial justice issues? So I think kind of cracking that nut and figuring out how we use sort of the existing union training programs to really sort of open them up to local communities, to, targeted higher communities, and to have broader sort of community benefits as we think about expanding this economy will be really important. And then I think the last thing I'll just mention is, the scale of the work. Like, we're just not doing enough clean energy work yet to deal with climate change. And a lot of that is, we need to think big and bold in terms of how we get this work done. I look at the numbers for retrofits in the US. We're retrofitting about 150,000 buildings a year in the US. We need to be retrofitting about 3 million a year if we're actually going to meet science-based targets. And that has big implications for the number of jobs that you're creating and how much, you're reducing energy use and emissions and seeing cost savings. So, figuring out how we really scale up clean energy work is also a big part of this. And it will be a big part of how we expand access to these jobs too, right? You just can't do that if you're not seeing enough investment to really sort of crack open the number of jobs that are being created.
Okay, that's a really comprehensive overview. John, do you want to add in any pieces from Mark and Lara? Oh,
Well, just to play off of a couple of themes that both Mark and Lara. Oh, are we? Am I there? Yes. Yes, we're good. Okay. Yeah, I think, to sort of mention, in terms of developing those big plans and, thinking about how to, meet the targets and, developing the kinds of resources, I think all those things seem, I think for a lot of unions, sort of almost like, they're hurdles that you can't get by, right? I think unions in Canada, both in the public and private sector, feel that they're sort of on the defensive, or they're seeing their their numbers go down, or they're seeing governments continue to take actions, legislatively or in support of corporations that are leading to loss of union jobs. Or undermining labor standards, right? And unions, I think, are sort of torn in, on any day, on in 10 or 12 different directions about trying to protect work and try to protect labor standards, and trying to protect their own members. So the climate crisis is just like a whole another issue, which is dumped on top of all of that. And I think that's sort of, that has been a sort of a hurdle in both Canada and the United States. And I think you could say that would be a case for other countries where you're seeing declines in, union density, and declines in union membership. So I think that's sort of the big sort of hurdle. And that then becomes a political question. How do those unions then turn that balance of power around, right? How do they, begin to take those big, bold steps forward? And that's a big question when you're fighting fires on 10 different issues at one time. So, and then especially, I think it's a big issue. Well, perhaps Mark might have other opinions, but I think it's a big issue for both the Steelworkers and for Unifor, the two largest private sector unions here, both of which have lots of members in fossil fuel areas and in fossil fuel led provinces. And at the same time, both of them are taking very progressive steps forward. In trying to, initiate either blue-green alliances, or pushing for decarbonization, or pushing for, build back better approaches where they're going to take on climate policies. So that leads to sort of caution in some sense about, how you can begin to sort of, think outside the box, and how you can then build a particular kind of, wider alliance within side of those unions, or in particular kinds of communities. So I think those are the big macro challenges that labor feels. They don't feel that they have the resources. They don't feel they necessarily have the education, and they feel that there's political issues inside their unions, which might be holding them back, right, from taking much more forward stances. But to tackle all this, there are ways forward, and I think you can see that where in both, let's say, in Climate Jobs New York or Climate Jobs Illinois, where suddenly you do have this big kinds of agreements to say, look, as Lara has just mentioned, you're looking at millions of jobs that are possible for everyone. If you do this strategically enough, through project labor agreements, through community benefit agreements, all those things suddenly mean that all those jobs going forward are going to be unionized, and they're also going to bring in millions of new people into unionized collective agreements, or under unionized collective agreement protection. So it's trying to sort of think strategically and bring those things forward. That is the big question, and how you sort of get everybody on side to say, look, we can do this, but we're going to have to really put, our shoulders to the grindstone and begin to say that we can do this, and we are seeing good examples elsewhere. But that's the big step, the big leap forward that I think labor movements have to face, and to some degree are trying to face. But they still, feel they're sort of they're still stuck, and moving forward is still. The question, and how to move forward is still the question that they're still grappling with.
So that's a perfect segue, actually, to the next thing. Oh, Mark, did you want to jump in?
I just wanted, if I could,
Yeah,
a couple of comments on some things that John and Laura said. In terms of, I think both, when John was talking about, declining union density, particularly in the private sector, which obviously is something that afflicts Canadian unions, but also obviously American unions as well. I do think when you're talking about hurdles, that's a central problem as well. And for the following reasons, that a lot of the jobs, particularly in the resource extraction sector, are in Canada, for the most part unionized, and they're pretty well paid jobs, right? You talk to a miner, you talk to someone who's who's working in Fort McMurray, they're well paid, often unionized jobs. And so when you start talking to those workers about transition, part of the problem is their mind immediately goes to low paid minimum wage service sector jobs, because those are the only other jobs in the community where they happen to live, other than the jobs, as Lara pointed out, that have supported that community often for generations. And so part of so in other words, facilitating unionization, making it easier to work for workers to unionize, is also a just transition plan, because it will grow the labor movement in the private sector and will grow the number of jobs in the private sector that currently exist, whether that's in the service sector or, again, amongst precarious workers. It will grow the number of jobs that are not directly tied to the fossil fuel sector, that workers can actually see themselves in and support their families with. That's the first point I wanted to make. I wanted also to say, Lara pointed out that this just transition issue is incredibly complicated, and we'll talk further about that. But I think that needs to be re-emphasized. The reality is, I was just doing it myself. We tend to, when we start talking about just transition, our minds tend to go to the beleaguered fossil fuel worker almost as a default. But the reality is, transitioning decarbonizing our economy is going to change virtually every workplace in our economy, right? There is that, we're going to make steel in a completely different way. We're going to make completely different cars, and we're going to make them in a different way. Our universities as workplaces, just as an example, Angela, are going to have to change and decarbonize in a variety of ways. And so I think it's not just specifically dealing with the kind of, the fossil fuel worker, or the worker the power plant worker that we automatically think. So we need to think more broadly about almost every workplace in our economy, and how we can transition those workplaces to decarbonized, whilst at the same time ensuring that there's a plan to preserve the jobs in those workplaces.
Lara, John, do you want to follow up on anything Mark is contributing there? I hear the problems and the hurdles, and obviously they're huge and multi-layered. But I would love to take a moment to just turn towards what is the next tangible step in your contexts that you think needs to be taken. And then the last piece, so we can spend a little bit of time on that. And then the last piece is, what's the one thing to watch from your context in the coming months? So if you can hold a really nice gem that we can take into the Q&A, just hold that. But for now, what's the next thing that needs to be done, or that you are pursuing to try to move this forward? John, how about we start with you this time?
Well, I guess there's lots of next steps. So the question is, I'm not necessarily the one to speak for trade unions in Canada, but ideally, if we were to, have unlimited resources and time, I think, taking some of the success that we've seen from the climate jobs initiatives in the United States, in terms of those alliances, and begin to see whether or not we can just get a labor-led alliance here going in some of the key cities or key provinces of Quebec and Ontario and British Columbia, where you have the largest workforces, you have the largest cities, you have the most construction workers, and I think you have the most sort of political clout available for unions, as well as for progressives in those areas. I think that would be the sort of a step forward, and begin to sort of lay out some of those strategies and those clear pathways, putting real numbers to jobs about what's going to happen if we begin to actually think strategically for expanding our renewable energy. What's it going to mean if we begin to think about what does building efficiency actually mean with a real target? How many more jobs are we going to get out of that? Can we retrofit, our public buildings with solar panels or with better energy efficiency? If we can expand our mass public transit and get people out of cars, what's that going to mean? And can we also begin to think about how we're going to retrofit and change our transportation systems? I think if some of the Unifor and USW and some of the construction workers were able to sort of pilot this, whether that's in Toronto or whether that's in Montreal, and see if they can actually get this off the ground as it has gotten off the ground in the United States, I think that'd be a great first step. big second step is that currently we're having another discussion about what a just transition is going to mean in Canada and what a just transition act is going to look like. Mark is right that we don't have a real clear sense to that. But I think if we're going to think about what a just transition act is going to mean, if we can have real labor involvement in having those discussions moving forward and creating sectoral committees for unions, across Canada, having real input on a national joint council on just transition and climate transition and clean energy transition. I think if those are sort of the institutions where labor can have a real say and really begin to sort of move forward on that debate. And then the other side of that is to actually, we just had a just transition workforce. We've just had just transition in coal in Alberta. Let's put some real numbers to the kinds of policies that we want for those fossil fuel communities. Let's tackle this head on. Jim Stanford, who's an economist out in Vancouver, BC, has said, look, this isn't as big a problem as we're making it out to be. In terms of actual fossil fuel workers, you're looking at 1% of the workforce. This is something we should be able to manage. Let's put income security programs together. Let's put some big training programs together. Let's give some money for vocational training and transition. Let's give relocation allowances. Let's put some real cash for clean energy transition in those communities, and that's going to make a huge kind of difference, for workers and for lives. But I think Mark's right. Until we actually see real plans and real leadership, it's going to be hard for workers to follow this idea that we should begin to transition. But I think if we, if that leadership and that sort of real big forward thinking takes place, then I think where labor is suddenly sort of cautious about climate change and the climate crisis, labor could suddenly be seen to taking a leadership role, and I think other people are going to start to buy in and they're going to start to listen. And that really then, I think, begins to move the needle forward. And certainly in Canada, we have to begin to see that needle move forward in terms of our policies. But labor has to be at that table to move that needle. And labor has to be at the forefront in making really progressive kinds of changes. And I think that would be ideal, is to see those three things happen, maybe not simultaneously, but certainly as a sort of a short-term plan here in moving Canada forward.
How about, and we're on CanCon with John's comments. Mark, do you want to add a little bit more of that Canadian perspective, and then we'll hear a contrast maybe with you, Lara? And I guess my real precise question with you from your chair, Mark, is how do we advance blue-green alliances in Canada? Like what's the next thing that needs to happen here, do you think? Where are you focusing your energy and attention?
Well, I think, in terms of where the alliance is focusing its attention, the first one I think was the one that John just elaborated on, and that's actually starting to put substance to the idea of what a just transition for workers might look like. But I want to raise one of the other issue that we're kind of focusing on, which is an actual industrial strategy for the country, a green industrial strategy for the country. One of the, I'm sort of sad to say this, but one of the byproducts actually of the pandemic has been that there's a renewed discussion about actually having a domestic manufacturing strategy in Canada, because it turns out that when you need, for example, personal protective equipment, relying entirely on global supply chain didn't work out so well for the country. And so, and Canada has not had really a domestic industrial strategy or manufacturing strategy again, and now for decades. And it is become apparent, and it's apparent to me, and I think it's apparent to the Canadian labor movement, that if we're going to have a prosperous decarbonized economy of the future, it is essential that we have, again, a national clean industrial strategy, and that we start to leverage. And frankly, the United States has been far ahead of Canada on this point, that we, for example, start to leverage government procurement both to decarbonize our economy, but also to create jobs here in Canada. And again, so you see programs like Buy America proliferating in the United States. You see little passes of legislation like the California statute that mandated clean procurement in California. Certainly from our perspective, those are the kinds of initiatives that we, in addition to talking about just transition, that we are advancing here in Canada, both at the federal, provincial, and municipal level. So that's I think a key issue going forward.
Lara, how about you? from where you sit in the United States, what is the next step?
Yeah, I think it really ties into what both Mark and John have just mentioned. When I think about where the work goes next in the US, we have about 25 US states that have passed some form of climate commitments to get to a net zero economy, to get a certain percentage of their energy from renewable energy sources. So we have this sort of wave of states passing these sort of climate goals and renewable energy goals. And now I sort of see us moving into the second phase of that, which is how do we actually do that? How do we actually get to those goals? And what does that look like? And how do we make it happen in the time frame that we need to make it happen? And I think, the most important thing there is having union coalitions that are established, that have a clear, cohesive, powerful voice in these debates, that have done the work to think about their opportunities and challenges in this transition, and then can be, active in shaping and driving that transition. And it's not just, when we talk about transition and just transition, I think we often think about how do we transition, workers who are displaced from a higher carbon industry to some new job in the clean energy economy. And I think we just have to think much bigger, right? Nobody knows the needs and interests of working people like labor does. Nobody knows their sectors and their industries and their workplaces like labor does. And labor has to be, a central player in designing this whole transition. And like Mark said, it's going to affect every aspect of our economies and our societies. And I just think if we're going to protect and support working people, if these are going to be good, high quality jobs, if we're going to do it in a way that can, build a more equitable economy, a strong economy, then labor is going to have to be central to designing every aspect of that transition. And I think, we're starting, John mentioned Illinois. We did work in Illinois for about a year with the unions there. They, at the end of that process, launched Climate Jobs Illinois. They now have, a broad swath of unions that come together, have a clear vision for how they want to tackle climate change in their state, and what activities are going to drive the most job creation, how to make those high quality jobs. And thankfully, they were established and ready to participate in this latest round of legislation that just happened in Illinois, which was, there were, climate and environmental groups who had been trying to pass clean energy legislation in Illinois for about 5 years, and it hadn't gone through. Now in this past session, it was finally passed, and we're now looking at it as sort of, the most sort of comprehensive and ambitious legislation in the US in terms of climate issues, labor issues, and equity issues. And it was a tough negotiation. It was really hard. And basically what they were doing is they were mapping out how they get to a net zero economy. And so, they had a coalition of, more than a dozen unions who were at the table. And, the environmental movement was saying, we have to shut down coal plants. We have to shut down gas plants if we're going to get to net zero. And these are the unions that are representing those members who are at the table and, having to make really hard decisions about, okay, how do we get to that? And how do we protect our members in that process? But also, how do we make sure that energy in the state is still going to be affordable? And that if we shut down these plants, we're not just building solar and wind facilities in other places that don't benefit local workers in our state at all, right? The jobs just all leave our state, and then the energy is produced somewhere else. Or how do we make sure that we have a transmission grid that can actually bring renewables to the places where it's being, consumed? All of those questions, they had to dig into the details of this for months and months, and then also think about, how do we make sure that we have the training pipeline from, local targeted, underserved communities to these new jobs? We need funding to do that. They have $10 million in that legislation to set up a whole new statewide pre-apprenticeship program that is specifically about clean energy jobs. And then, most importantly, from their perspective, they were able to get the most comprehensive and ambitious labor standards on clean energy work that have happened anywhere in the US. So they now have prevailing wage on anything that's above residential scale solar work. Anything that's bigger than residential scale, they have a prevailing wage standard on it, a minimum wage standard. They also have project labor agreements on anything that's above 2 megawatts, which is a pretty small project. They have labor neutrality and peace. It's a really impressive piece of legislation, and it was absolutely critical that Climate Jobs Illinois and that coalition of unions were able to be actively engaged in those negotiations and really shape where it landed. They have important things like every 5 years they're checking in. How much renewable energy has been built in the state? Is that going to be able to supply the power that's being shut down? Which plants should be shut down first based on pollution, but also job quality? How many people are employed at those jobs, and what are the quality of those jobs, and what are the larger economic impacts of those plants being shut down? So there's just a lot. We're actually still really sort of digging through it to understand everything that was sort of negotiated there. But just again to just emphasize how important it was to have that coalition that could be actively engaged in that legislation, which is what I think is going to happen now in a bunch of states, which is it's really going to be mapping out how do we get to those targets, not just committing to those targets, but like let's actually map out how we get there and what the impacts of that are.
Okay, that's excellent. And so as a follow-up to that, and if you've already answered it, just signal that, but is there any one kind of breaking issue or trend that you're just seeing develop now that's worth watching in the next couple of years? Anything new that's bubbling up out of the US that we should be, keeping in our pockets, say in Canada and internationally?
Yeah.
What do you think?
I think what I just mentioned, is probably going to be a lot of what we see over the next 5 to 10 years. It's just a really nitty gritty negotiation of how this transition to a low carbon, net zero economy happens. And keep in mind, like Mark said, there are a number of aspects of this transition that we still don't know how to do. We don't know how to make cement. We don't know how to produce steel. We don't know how to fly planes or run ships. Without in a way that doesn't produce many emissions, right? So there's a lot of technological advancements that need to happen and are happening, but there's going to be a lot to pay attention to there to understand what the sort of labor and employment impacts of that are going to be, and figuring out how we get to net zero. I think in terms of, the other gem, kind of the takeaway that I have, from the work that we've been doing, I just think it's so important for labor to be able to come together and develop its own vision and plans for how to take on climate change and do it in a way that's going to create high quality union jobs. And, our focus continues to be, okay, let's look at the science. Let's look at what science says we need to do in terms of emissions reduction. And renewable energy production. We know that's important, but we're going to be forward looking in terms of what needs to be built to get to those goals. What needs to be built in the energy sector, what needs to be done in the transportation sector, the industrial sector, the building sector, energy sector. How much is it going to cost? How do we pay for it, right? How do we get to that scale that we've been talking about? How many jobs is it going to create? And then again, how do we make sure that these are going to be high quality union jobs? So that continues to be kind of our focus. We think that that's a really important role for labor to play and organized labor to play in making sure that we're going to build out, in a large, equitable, clean energy economy.
Okay, so I'm hearing you that the devil or the opportunity is in the details there, right? Okay, and that's where the action is in the coming 5 or so years. Okay, fascinating. Mark, and then John, any last thing to watch, issue to pay attention to? Something that might be breaking that we can't see yet in the literature? What's going on?
Couple things, or maybe 3 things. So in terms of in Canada, for those who don't closely follow Canadian politics, you may know we just had a federal election in which we re-elected much the same government as we had before the election. But that government, as John alluded to, I think earlier, ran in 2019 on the promise of introducing a Just Transition Act, a Just Transition Statute. No such act has appeared. I think in large measure, and I say this with some knowledge, because although they proposed it, they actually didn't really know what such a statute would even look like. Like, to be totally honest, it was kind of a promise made during an election campaign, again, with no substance whatsoever. So actually, just before the election, the federal government launched a consultation process as to what such a statute might look like. It's being run by Natural Resources Canada, and that consultation started before the election and is now continuing after the election. So that's something to look at. And in terms of the kind of position that the labor movement is advancing. I think to Lara's point, I think more even important than a statute that might contain supports for workers, I think the more important part is that there needs to be a just transition ministry or some part of government that is devoted to this issue. Because at the moment, at least in Canada, at almost all levels of government, this particular issue of economic transition as a result of decarbonization is spread between so many different parts of government. It's not really a focus of any part of that government, and so it's not getting the attention it deserves. So I actually think governments need to consolidate this issue into one part of and focus in that way. The other couple issues I want to talk about, just quickly to mention, I think we're seeing a renewed focus from many governments in Canada on this question of infrastructure. Obviously, it's a huge focus in the United States right away, but being able to leverage infrastructure investment to both decarbonize the economy and create good union jobs is going to be a key issue in Canada going forward over the next couple of years. And I wanted to flag one last issue. I think it's going to become a larger part of the conversation here in Canada, is this intersection between trade and decarbonization. I think we're already seeing in Canada conversations around carbon border adjustments. You're seeing that conversation happen in the United States. Europe has obviously just introduced a carbon border adjustment policy. And for folks who don't necessarily follow the ins and outs of this, that is essentially putting a price on carbon at your border on imported goods. So to give you an example, in Canada, we produce essentially the lowest carbon emissions aluminum in the world. We have an aluminum industry primarily based in Quebec, but also some in British Columbia, that is, again, amongst the lowest carbon footprint in the world. And that aluminum is competing with other jurisdictions where the carbon footprint of that aluminum is much, much, much higher. And so in order for there to be a level playing field globally, there has to be some way of incorporating the price of carbon into aluminum produced around the world. And so I think you're going to see that conversation also start to become more prominent, at least in parts of Canada and the world over the coming years.
Okay, thank you. I take your point to heart about the institutional building that needs to happen to support this. And as soon as you say, this is being led by natural resources, as someone who studies the fossil fuel industry, that concerns me. It might not be the right house to put just transition in, for sure. Okay, John, any last comments on the GEM? And then we already have a great question coming in. Then we're going to open it up to Q&A. There's a question in the chat actually from Gregor. John, any last thoughts? A GEM, something to look out for unfolding?
Yeah, just to follow up on a couple of Mark's comments, that we do have, I think, a political opportunity, and Labour has a political opportunity to sort of really begin to sort of move that debate forward, and especially on this issue about just transition. And Mark's already mentioned the fact that we need some sort of ministry, but it might be better to have what's called a secretariat in the parliamentary tradition. That is an agency inside of government that cuts across all ministries and is responsible for ensuring that there's clean energy and there's going to be a transition plan moving forward. And able to put its voice to saying, we need a ministry or we need a secretariat. I think that's, making those kind of institutional claims and making sure it's actually in that act, so that we're going to see real labor input, and we're going to see some real concentration by government, I think would be something that would, try to advance that debate forward for Canadian workers and for Canadian unions. As part of that too, Mark's also mentioned that we actually have to make sure that the kinds of procurement that we're going to do, or the kinds of building that we're going to do, are going to be clean, and so that should be another part of the Just Transition Act as well, right? And I think Labour really has to put its voice to say, look, we need, we need clean, decarbon material across any kind of new project, and we need to be thinking seriously about that. And I think that'd be another really important thing that Labour should be able to push for in a new Just Transition Act. And then lastly, at an international level, and this is what's happening with the UN and with current climate treaty talks, is talking about nationally determined contributions. And this is also what's being tracked. Canada currently doesn't say anything about its labor standards or its green public procurement. Ability Act, where we're supposed to be tracking what our emissions are doing, and we're supposed to be tracking about how we're trying to meet it across a number of areas, everything from renewable energy to energy efficiency to transit to agriculture and building efficiency. So we need to make sure that labor has a voice, in those nationally determined contributions. And I think this should be another part of that new Just Transition Act, that we actually make certain that labor is going to have a voice in establishing those nationally determined contributions, and that Canada meets its goals and its international commitments to, bringing Canada within a 1.5 degree, temperature range in the near future, so that we can meet those net zero things. So focusing on net zero, but also sort of focusing on what kinds of things we can do legislatively. I'm hoping that would all sort of also, focus the minds, but also get us really thinking about those sort of big picture things, and making sure that labor is front and center in devising new kinds of legislation that's going to benefit everyone.
All right, you are the most well-behaved panel. We're right on time. This is just what we were hoping to do. So now we have some time to open it up. Gregor Murray has got a great question. Gregor, are you still with us? And if so, do you want to come on camera and open up your mic to ask your question about labor moving at baby speed and capital at lightning speed? Is Gregor still with us? And Jack, we might need your help bringing him into
Hello.
There you.
Okay.
Hi,
yeah.
Jack. Greg.
Hi. Is Gregor here? I don't see a request. Gregor, if you're with us, you can request to add your audio and visual to the screen. There's a green button on the top right. It should be. If not, oh yes, I see you now. And so I'm just going to add you.
Excellent. We get to see Gregor. So Gregor, you can ask your question in your own voice. There you go. Welcome to the panel.
Great. Thank you. Terrific panel. And thanks to you all. Okay, I'll express my great anxiety. And having talked to a lot of companies recently as well, I have the impression that labor is proceeding with baby steps and capital is moving at the speed of light. In other words, there's this infinite fluidity and ability to innovate around risk, around anticipated regulatory requirements. So I'm not making an argument that the drive will come from there, but in fact, the drive is coming from there. That companies are looking at the horizon and saying we need to do these things. So I kind of have the impression that there's a great differential movement here. And as well, I also have the impression, and correct me if I'm wrong, but Lara's very grounded approach is really interesting because of sets of items that it introduces, because I often have the impression that, and I guess this particularly for Mark, that climate change is way up there, but it's very difficult to percolate down in practical ways. So you see, for example, the way the Germans are working on pictures of what their workplaces will look like in the future, and the impact that this has on skills, and the way that they need to work through this in that social dialogue way. And I don't want to be Pollyannish about it, but you understand what that kind of structure might mean, with the state putting in significant resources, and indeed even saying that if you get a bigger grant if you have an agreement with your union for climate transition. Our governments are a long way from there, and I'm not even sure that we're advocating for those kinds of approaches. And I guess that, Lara, you've had to build these up from the bottom up without counting on too much state support. But I'm not sure. So you see where I'm getting at. I've spoken enough. Thanks for your great contributions.
Thank you, Gregor. And if you want to stay on with us as folks, take a jab at your question. Lara, do you want to, I guess, respond to some of those detailed questions that Gregor is asking at the end there? Then Mark and John, just jump on in where it appeals to you.
Yeah, I think, Gregor, if I understand, what you're getting at, I mean, I think about this in terms of a situation we're facing in the offshore wind industry right now. You know, a lot of offshore wind has been built in Europe. Many of the largest companies in the world are based in Europe. They're now coming to the US. They have contracts to do these projects. They're making all sorts of plans in terms of how these projects will be built, where the manufacturing and fabrication work will be done. And, you know, and although they're mostly union and employ mostly union labor in Europe, it's clear that to the extent that they can get around working with unions in the US, they will. We're seeing a number of signs of that. It's very concerning. And at the same time, this is a brand new industry, and we have so much to learn about it, you know, and we have so much to learn about what the work is and what type of skills are needed to do this work. You know, we were just thinking today around offshore wind operations and maintenance. How often do you go out and apply an industrial coating to those turbines? You know, how many weeks are the workers out on the water? Do you need a composite crew that's doing this work? These types of questions, you know, and, you know, we're doing it, you know, with a labor movement that's been under attack for decades. Right. And workers' rights and collective representation have been under attack for decades. And so we've seen a weakening of the labor movement. We have fewer resources and capacity, you know, to be engaged and to be figuring out these questions. At the same time, we're dealing with the largest, you know, offshore wind companies and renewable energy companies in the world that are coming in to do this work. So, yeah, I think, you know, there's a lot of concerns on that front, and how we get up to speed and how we get in early, right? Because we know if this industry starts to get away from us, it's going to be a lot harder to come in later and say, hey, what about the job quality? What about these being union jobs?
That's lots of foresight there, Lara, for sure. Mark, John, do you have comments to add in response to Gregor?
Well, I mean, let me pick up a little bit on the offshore wind points that Lara was making. I mean, I appreciate your point, Gregor, that I think you're right, that some parts of the Canadian business community are moving quickly on this issue, but others, I gotta say, are not. And I think wind energy is a good example. So in Canada at the moment, there are exactly 0 plans for any offshore wind capacity. In part in Ontario, for example, where I live, there was a moratorium, in fact, on offshore wind development. Furthermore, in Canada, we at the moment, not a single wind turbine component is actually manufactured anywhere in Canada. 0. We don't make towers, we don't make blades, we don't make the turbines. And the reason for that is we haven't had a strategy to be able to attract that kind of investment, or even, like, there was a plan, like one of the first things that BlueGreen Canada became actively involved in was actually the much maligned Ontario Green Energy Act, which, whilst it had its problems, did at least contain domestic manufacturing requirements, for example, for wind capacity. And it actually provoked several facilities to open in Ontario, and also caused wind turbine towers to be manufactured at Algoma Steel and Sault Ste. Marie. I know I'm getting looking at a small picture here. The problem was that statute, the domestic content requirements were struck down by the World Trade Organization, and B, it was then repealed by the government by the government that was elected after the government that introduced it. And so we are really at the very early stages of actually building that kind of industrial capacity to take advantage of issues like renewable energy. And the problem is the labor movement is aware of this problem, and the labor movement is doing what it can to push governments to move in this direction. But again, it kind of comes back to what I was saying earlier, which is that in Canada, at least, we haven't really had a particularly robust economic and industrial strategy for decades. And so the labor movement can push governments to act on this, but governments don't have they don't have that kind of, infrastructure to even be able to start with that kind of industrial planning. So that's been sort of the problem on the industrial level, as I see it here in Canada.
So John is having some internet issues, actually. But do you want to give a try? John, do you have any thoughts to add, or is it just not working for you? Oh, he looks completely frozen.
Angela, I just wanted to let you know, I just got a message that I need to pick my daughter up from daycare, so I will unfortunately have to sign off from our session a little bit early.
That's
I'll be
fine.
about 5 minutes, so just apologies to everyone.
That's okay. Okay, so we do have, John, it looks like you are back. Do you want to comment in response to Gregor's question, or how's it going?
Well, I'm not sure if I'm breaking up or.
You're kind of in and out. Yeah, you're kind of in and out. Oh, okay. All right, excellent. So another question that is coming out just from Q&A here is about connections between, so we've talked in this discussion, it's been very much like what's going on in Canada, what's happening in the United States. But where do you see opportunities for this to be an integrated, North American just transition effort? We talk about the countries as if they're separate, but from an energy perspective and from a trade perspective, there's very integrated. So Lara, Mark, any thoughts on, are these alliances connected? Are we sharing enough? What could we be doing differently in that space? Maybe Lara, you first, if you've got a little kid to pick up.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I think maybe Mark can speak to this better than I can. I think, at a very basic level, we do strive to share experiences and strategies across these labor and blue-green coalitions, as much as possible. And I think we could always do more of that. And of course, in industries like offshore wind that we're talking about, we're going to be dealing with a lot of the same companies and developers. And so the more that we can be coordinating and collaborating and making sure that we're raising standards, across countries and across regions, I think, we should be doing that. And is there potential to have, broader, agreements than we would normally anticipate to ensure that there are good standards across the industry? So I think at the very least, that's the one thing that kind of pops into my head is, how do we do better coordination, collaboration, share experiences and strategies across these coalitions and strive to raise standards across our countries?
Mark, tell us how we're going to do it.
Well, I think there's two sort of levels at which there's real opportunities for collaboration. I mean, first of all, I will say, those of us in Canada who are active in this space have learned a great deal from, for example, as I mentioned earlier, the Buy Clean California Coalition that put together that ultimately successful statute. We have a lot to learn from the kind of work that Lara is doing, whether that's in New York or Illinois, in terms of developing clean energy jobs that have projects that have sort of project labor standard agreements. That's not something that Canada has traditionally done all that much of, in part, because we still have higher union density than the United States in the private sector, but working, sort of building those kind of especially sub-national coalitions that it could advance. You see some of this in Toronto and elsewhere in the country, but those kind of sub-national coalitions that can, work more on the ground and build that kind of momentum towards both the creation of good jobs, good green jobs, as the saying goes. But I think that so I think there's both exchanges in terms of strategy, as Lara talked about, but there's also, I think, a sort of policy integration that needs to happen. If the current U.S. administration's infrastructure bills ever manage to figure out a way of getting through Congress, there's an enormous amount of investment there in Biden's plan that is going to have spillover effects into the Canadian economy, right? There is a real opportunity for both the Canadian and US governments to work together, both in terms of harmonizing their industrial strategy, harmonizing their decarbonization strategy, and their sort of carbon emissions objectives, and working together as a kind of block. Whether that's, not necessarily in terms of a carbon price policy, but in terms of infrastructure policy, in terms of infrastructure standards, all of those, because when the United States procurement market is 10 times the size of the Canadian procurement market. And so that procurement market again, is important for Canadian manufacturers, and it's also and also the kind of if the standards and the kind of changes that the Biden administration is contemplating will have a spillover effect on Canadian industry. And so the more that our two countries at a national level can get together in terms of their approach to these issues, I think the more likely it is that both of our economies and our workers will benefit.
You're telling me you got to go, Lara?
I do, yes. I'm going to sign off. I just want to say thank you so much to you, Angela, and to Mark and John. It was a real pleasure to be able to do this. Again, apologize for having to leave early, but thanks to everyone for the opportunity. I really appreciate it.
Great.
Well, kids first. Thanks for all the work
Thanks
that you're
to you,
doing. It's a
Laura.
real inspiration.
Great. All right. Thank you.
Bye.
So much. Really.
I think John has more stable network there now. John, did you want to jump in? There were a couple comments there that you couldn't get through.
In terms of sharing,
you are really breaking up. Mark, can you hear him on your end?
No, but it might help, John, if you turned your camera off.
Yeah, that's a great idea. John, can you turn your camera off? Maybe that will help. No, I don't think you
plug
can
in
hear us.
For the University of Montreal. One of the big projects that we're with research rep, and we're gathering cases. Oh,
no, sorry, it's not. We're only catching a word in a sentence. I'm not sure what to do about that. I'm sorry, Jack. If you have any advice, Mark's advice to you, John, was to turn off your camera and see if that would give you a bit more space.
Yes, perhaps try turning off your camera, and if not, we'll just go to Mark.
Yeah. All right, so give that a try, John. So you want to unmute there?
now, is that any better?
That's a lot better. Go for it.
It's much, much better. Okay, well, we'll try again here then. So maybe it's better looking this way too, perhaps. Just in terms of collaboration and sort of international collaboration, I hope that labor environmentalists would be happy to hear that as part of the University of Montreal and its the Interuniversity Research Center on Globalization and Work. It's currently involved in a large international collaboration looking at what are the best practices that we see around the world in achieving better work. And one of the things that we're certainly trying to do is collect cases on just transition or on a clean economy around the world. And so we're certainly very interested in what Lara and the climate jobs people are doing in New York. We're also doing some research in Germany, and we're also looking at Denmark as possible cases here where we can sort of really sort of get a good sense about what unions are doing, what success they've had, what challenges they've faced. And what are the best ways forward? So we're doing a bit of that. On a more other sort of ideal for the national Canada's labor movement, I think it would be great to see a just transition committee struck at the Canadian Labour Congress, where we're continually talking and thinking and having some labor leaders and staff continually discussing about what policies are there and what that actually means and how we're going to work together in trying to influence the climate policy debates, but also try to actually bring some of that expertise together and also begin to sort of think this thing through about the kinds of resources that we might need to make a real difference for everyone. And that would be another way that we can begin to collaborate across countries, either with the AFL-CIO or with the European Trade Union Confederation, which is also now just recently established a just transition committee across the European Union. So I think that might be something else that we could think about institutionally for the labor movements here in Canada and in the United States, as well as in Western Europe.
Okay, so we've got a last question that's come in the chat. So this will be actually, I think, something that both of you could really tackle. So it's well timed. So I'll just read it. Unless Guy, do you want to come in to the person who asked it? Guy, do you want to come on camera, come on mic, or shall I just read it? I think I'll just read it because we only have 10 minutes, 9 minutes. Are there any big lessons to learn from labor or from how labor handled declines in coal communities in the US and Canada that we might bring to eventual oil and gas declines? So how do we take lessons from a coal phase out and bring them into what needs to be an oil and gas phase out? Mark, do you want to have a go?
Well, so just a bit of background. Canada announced 4 years ago that it was going to end coal-powered electricity generation by 2030. The province of Alberta had made a similar announcement in 2015, and it has been pretty clear for some time now that coal-powered electricity generation in Canada was going to come to a halt within the next, well, actually much quicker than by 2030. As a result, the federal government struck, and it's been alluded to in this discussion, a coal transition task force for affected workers and communities. I was on that task force, and we produced we traveled to pretty much every coal mining and thermal and electricity generating community in the country, and we produced a report at the end of 2018. It actually came out at the beginning of 2019. Without getting into all the details, the report contained, as these reports do, voluminous recommendations, and as often the case in Canada, essentially none of those recommendations have actually been implemented. So I guess the first thing I would say is, if you're going to, it's good to do some research and produce a report and have the report propose a plan, but there has to be some follow through in actually coming up with a plan. Having said that, however, a few observations. The government of Alberta, under Rachel Notley, also had a coal transition plan and a task force, and actually did implement some legislation to support workers in that context. And the federal government kicked in a certain amount of money to help develop transition centers. And I think the lesson from that, from speaking to workers, is look, thermal coal electricity generation and mining is a very small part of the Canadian economy, but nonetheless, it is really important to those communities where it takes place. And so the transition conversation has to be based first and foremost in those communities. And this gets back to the point we were talking about earlier about there has to be a part of government, whether it's an authority, a ministry, or whatever, however you want to describe it, that is devoted to this issue. Because what matters actually most to workers in those communities is that they have a just transition center or office of some sort in their community that they can actually go to get help, whether that's help in terms of accessing government programs, whether that's help in terms of finding other employment either in the area or even far away. That's the first thing that you actually need. And so what I think, for coal workers and eventually I think for fossil fuel workers, any transition is going to have an important and central community-based component, and a place and easily accessed services from government that workers can access. So I guess that's something that I would advocate for, that we've learned from the coal transition process.
John? Last thoughts?
Yeah, in terms of coal, two of the other really big transitions that are ongoing now is one is in Germany and the other's in Spain. In both cases, the countries have made commitments to phase out coal over time. Both of them are looking at a phase out, somewhere in the 2030s. But just as Mark has said, the only way that this actually occurred and has occurred well is by labor taking a leading role in discussing what that transition is going to look like and what that phase out is going to mean. And in both cases, you had a lot of discussions about what kinds of retraining, what kinds of pensions are needed for workers, especially for older workers, what kinds of income assistance or relocation allowances might be available for workers, whether or not they can be retrained. Many workers would want to stay in those communities. So then there was a question of, how do you environmentally remediate coal mines and some of the coal infrastructure and processing. So that also led to diversification plans and new investments. But I think the point is that many of these are as Mark has noted, they have to have direct union involvement, and they have to then have the community involved in developing those plans. It takes time to do that, and it takes real effort. But where you see, unions, coming together and, working really well with the community over time, they've developed very comprehensive transition plans for those kinds of communities. There's still a debate about what that transition is going to look like in Spain, but you are seeing, a real diversification and a transformation taking place now in Germany as it moves away from coal, even though it's still a tremendously controversial issue. Now the idea is that transition is going to happen, and it's going to happen well.
Angela, you're muted.
I knew I'd do that at least once. Thank you. We are nearly up at the end of our time, and it occurs to me that this is the end of the third day of a full 3 days of really interesting and engaging thoughts on what it takes to democratize work in a global context. I would just pop in the chat here that there is one last form, and this is on concluding thoughts. I'm leaving the number there so you can find that if you would like to go to that one, as well as the time zones that go with it. But I do want to end on the note of saying thank you so much to John and Mark and Lara for bringing their expertise to this table. And as Gregor has said in the chat, it's true. This is really insightful and also really hopeful. Lots of work to do, but so great to see that it's getting started and we can have a labor-led approach here, which is essential. So thank you to everybody. And I hope to see your research in the coming years and the action on the ground. Thanks very much.